AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. And today, I'm very pleased to say we are bringing you an amazing story. It is the story of the Kim brothers, 5 Korean Americans, all of whom were born overseas, joined the U.S. Army, and endured and fought in China and Korea during the Second World War and the Korean War. And then all became U.S. citizens, and several of them joined CIA and other aspects of U.S. intelligence. Joining me on camera today are Art Kim and Dick Kim. Art's the youngest of the 5 brothers. Dick's the next. Dick was a U.S. Army officer. He's also a former ordained minister and served in intelligence. Art's a former U.S. Army officer, joined the CIA, served in Korea, and then worked for CIA for a number of years. And I'm pleased to say is one of the very earliest members of AFIO. Joining us on screen is Robert Kim, not a family relation, but a well-known author who has written the book that is the story of these 5 brothers. It is called Victory in Shanghai. I've just finished it, and I can tell you it is an amazing story of a patriotic family. Gentlemen, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thank you.
Dick and Art, how did you meet Robert Kim?
Well, I'm the one that met Robert some 7.5 years ago. There was a friend of mine that worked with me at the agency by the name of Bill Brown. I hadn't seen him or talked to him in over 10 years. And he one day called me. He says, Art, this is Bill Brown. Let's have lunch. And we had lunch right across the street at a Chinese restaurant. And he brought Robert. Why he brought Robert is beyond me. But nevertheless, after lunch, Robert invited me to his house, which is right across the street from the restaurant. And he was trolling on his computer, and he came across a picture of an Asian American lieutenant standing next to a C-47 and said, I don't know who this man is. I said, that's my brother. Well, that started a huge and a long research on the part of Robert. And luckily, Robert was not fully employed then and had a lot of time, did a lot of research. He knows more about our family than I know, frankly, because he's able to do a lot of research on his own that I was not privy to. And so we chatted periodically. And then Dick came down one day and he met Robert as well. Actually, Dick even married Robert and Kelly. So that was the introduction that I had with Robert.
Robert, tell our audience a little bit about the history of Japan and Korea and China after World War I and running up to World War II.
Yes, I think most people are familiar with the Japanese occupation and colonization of Korea in the early 20th century, which lasted until 1945. What's not as well known is that that was a period of great change in Korea when, at the same time as the country was gradually being conquered and colonized by Japan, there was a great influx of American missionaries, of American ideas, and a real flourishing of a missionary movement in Korea that resulted in the conversion to Christianity and of much of the emerging educated class and their embrace of Western ideals brought specifically by Americans. And it was during this time that, in a way, Korea moved away from the Chinese culture that had been prevailed in it for centuries and really moved toward the West. And Dick and Art's family was very much a part of that movement. They were from Pyongyang, which was really the center of this missionary movement, and were drawn toward the United States really in that period of time that you're talking about. in the 1910s and 1920s.
Richard, tell us about your father, Kim Chang-sai, his achievements and the impact on your family.
Who is it? Talking to me?
Yeah.
Oh, the question again, Jim?
Tell us about your father, Kim Chang-sai, and what he did and the impact that had on your family.
Well, that's my father. Kim Chang-sai is my father. He was educated by missionaries over there in Korea and ended up at Yonsei University, which is considered the Yale of Korea, where he received his medical degree. And after his reception, in fact, when he graduated, he spoke English and wrote everything in English so well that upon graduation, he gave the graduation speech in English. And 100 years later, my nephew's son, Jonathan, went to Korea to do graduate work at Yonsei and to learn Korean. And upon graduating in that year, he spoke Korean so well that he gave the graduation speech in Korean. But at any event, the family then moved to Shanghai in 1920, and that's where our lives began.
Why did your family members become Chinese citizens and move to Shanghai?
Well, when they went to Shanghai in the 20s, that's when they adopted the Chinese citizenship to avoid the Japanese control of things. And, that's when they became Chinese citizens. And our uncle, An Chang-ho, is one of the leaders of the Korean independence movement. And he and Dad were very close because his wife is my mother's oldest sister. And An Chang-ho then became the leader of the independence movement in Shanghai. Dad was associated with him. And then in 1932 or thereabouts, Chang-ho was arrested and taken back to Korea. But Dad, of course, had come to the States in 1930, before Art was born, to do work in New York to establish a medical clinic in Chinatown at the invitation of the mayor at that time of New York City. And then, of course, he then went to Johns Hopkins University in 1925 to earn his Doctor of Public Health. And upon graduating from there, he traveled in Europe a lot. And after traveling, he came back to the States and then came to Los Angeles to pick up the family, which consisted then of my mother, my oldest brother, a second brother, a third brother, and a sister, and moved them to Shanghai, to Korea first, to join the University of Yonsei. But because of the Japanese control of the country, Dad didn't find that a good option for him, so he moved the whole family to Shanghai, where Art was born in 1930, and where I was raised until I left Shanghai in 1944 with an older brother.
What was life like for your mother and your brothers and sister living in Shanghai?
Well, living in Shanghai, we were pretty much Americanized. We spoke English, hardly spoke Korean, and learned some Chinese, but our communication in the family was primarily English. We went to missionary schools and a Shanghai American school in Shanghai, and until the war happened. And when the war happened in 1941, my older brother and Peter and I escaped from Shanghai and went to the interior, where we both joined the U.S. Army.
How long did it take you from the time you left Shanghai until you actually arrived in an area that was occupied by U.S. forces and you could join the U.S. Army?
Well, we left on the 10th of May, 1944, and it wasn't until a month later that we arrived in free China. But en route to the free China, we encountered a friend in Kukong. He was an American officer, Asian, but en route to Shanghai on a secret mission. He was a lieutenant in the Army, so we met him at one of the local stops, and Peter was very afraid that he had been sought out by the Japanese. But it turned out to be Jack Young, Lieutenant Jack Young, who then went to Shanghai. We gave him all of our citizen papers, Shanghai occupation papers, so he could convert them and use them as he saw fit. But when he went to Shanghai, he was safe housed by my sister-in-law, who happened to be the wife of Ernest Moy, a very prominent Chinese American. He gave me residence. I mean, I lived with Ernest in Chongqing once I got in, and a very strange relationship. Ernest and Ruth were married, but then they got divorced, and my oldest brother Peter, married Ruth, and she became Pete's wife. But in Shanghai, it wasn't maybe 2 weeks traveling. We stopped at a place called Kukong, and that's where we met two P-38 aircraft pilots who made an emergency landing there in Kukong. But I thought that we were being strafed, but they landed at a secret airfield there in Kukong, and both Peter and I, elatedly ran out to meet them. We didn't recognize any of the insignia, the white star with a white bar. The only signal we remembered was a star with a red ball. But in any event, these are two huge Texas residents. And when they saw Peter, they thought he was a pilot who had been shot down. And they offered to put us in their aircraft, take us out of there. But we were with a group, so we said no, we had to stay with the group. But then 2 weeks later, we finally got to a city called Hanyang and then Changsha. Both cities were then later taken over by the Japanese. But Peter, once we reached Guilin, about 4 weeks after we left Shanghai, Peter met a lot of friends who had joined the army after they were evacuated from Shanghai. And he was flown up to Chongqing for debriefing immediately. And I was put under the supervision of the U.S. consulate there in Guilin, who, when we had to evacuate Guilin because of the Japanese invasion, I joined one of the consulate, put me on a military convoy that went to Kunming. And that took us maybe 5 days, about a week, and I got to Guilin. And when I got there, of course, Ernest Moy picked me up and gave me residence in his own hostel and took care of me until I joined the army in December of 44. But it took us about a month to arrive in free China from Shanghai.
How Peter joined the U.S. Army, and what happened to him after he joined the Army?
Well, he joined the Army and joined the Joint Intelligence Collection Agency and became very friendly with General Marshall Carter, who was then a colonel and assistant G5. The G5 was a General Olmsted. And Peter and Marshall being very good friends, and Marshall, of course, recognized Peter's background. Yes. And so they were lifelong friends. Peter was on a mission with some Chinese generals to look over the coastal area for possible invasion by U.S. forces. Upon return to Chongqing, he found out that a team had been organized to go to Shanghai. This is in August 45. And General Armstead had promised Peter that if the mission was ever appointed to go to Shanghai, that he would be on the mission. Well, Peter then hastily barged into Olmsted's office while they're having a staff meeting. As and confronted General Armstead about the promise he made that he would be on a mission. And so Marshal Carter then had Peter join him and review the plans for the team to go to Shanghai. This is 1945, after the bombs had been dropped, and Peter then was told that he could join the mission, and Marshal Carter called the assistant ambassador, the minister anyway, and he came over with a piece of paper certifying that Peter was General Wedemeyer and the ambassador's personal representative to Shanghai to see to it that the prisoners of war and the civilian internees were cared for. And Peter was then rushed down to the Luzhou airfield, where a plane was ready to leave the airfield to go to Shanghai. There were two C-46s loaded, and Peter, a lieutenant, not really a lieutenant, corporal in the Army, but made lieutenant by General Carter to Shanghai on the 18th of August. And that's when Arthur saw these two planes fly over Shanghai, not recognizing the insignia, but that was Peter asking the pilot to fly over the house so that the family would know that there was an American plane coming over.
Of course, we didn't
tell that part. Art, talk about seeing the plane fly over the house.
Yeah. Well, the plane came over twice, buzzed the house, and we didn't recognize the airplane, nor did we recognize the insignia. And I'll never forget, August 18th is the day after my mother's birthday. And it was weeks later. We lived in the Chinese section of Shanghai. Weeks later, we had a Caucasian in a suit walk in our lane, come to our house, and of course, a huge crowd followed this Caucasian. And when he stopped at our house, the house number was number 10. He knocked on the door, and my mother opened the door, and he identified himself as Swiss consulate representative. And by that time, my brother Dave, who was hiding for fear that it was the Japanese that was at the door, but when he heard English being spoken, he came out and met the vice consul, and he said, "Your brother Pete is in Shanghai. He's at the airport." And to reinforce the story, the vice consul carried a pack of Lucky Strike cigarette as to confirm or to authenticate Pete being in Shanghai, because Pete's favorite cigarette was Lucky Strike at that time. And he left, and I think it was 2 weeks later that Pete came in to Shanghai, to our lane, with a Jeep. We never saw this funny-looking vehicle. And a big crowd followed the Jeep as it came to our house. And on the passenger side was Pete in uniform. Of course, we didn't know that he was in the Army. And that was really a big celebration for the neighborhood. The Chinese neighbors really were happy to see Pete. They recognized him despite his uniform.
What were Pete's responsibilities and the responsibilities of the small American team after they arrived in Shanghai and began dealing with the Japanese occupation forces?
Yeah.
Well, prior to our leaving Shanghai, after Pearl Harbor, Peter worked for what was called the American Association, and that was led by the leading Americans in the community. And when they were all interned, Peter then became the sole knowledgeable person about the American assets in Shanghai. And so he worked with the Swiss consulate and arranged for all some of the interned Americans and British and others to be repatriated from Shanghai in exchange for the Japanese in America. And so Pete then became very much involved in seeing that several hundred Americans and others who were evacuated on the Gripsholm in 1942 and 1943. And many of those people then went to India and joined the army. And that's when we encountered many of Pete's friends who he saw go into internment camps when we were in Shanghai. But then himself being in the army and these people being in the service. But Pete's job was primarily to see to it that the thousands of civilians who were interned were cared for, and the prisoners of war were cared for, and acting as the sole representative of the ambassador and the commanding general Wedemeyer. It was a very highly important job, but he wasn't really an officer. He was a corporal in the army, but it wore the bars of a first lieutenant. And he served in Shanghai until his status became exposed. He awarded the Soldier's Medal. And then, it was embarrassing for him and for the family, for him all of a sudden to be demoted, in effect, to a corporal. And all of his friends in Shanghai thought he was an American officer. But then later, things were corrected by Brother Jim, by his being made an officer by act of Congress and given citizenship by the act of Congress.
Actually, maybe I might be able to add a little bit to that. Yeah, the mission to Shanghai, which was called Operation Sparrow, was one of the wave of missions that were sent out to liberate prisoner of war camps and civilian internment camps all over China and French Indochina. The best known of those were probably the ones led by the OSS into northern China to liberate the POW camps, mostly in Manchuria. But Operation Sparrow was actually the biggest of them all, because their mission was to liberate about 7,000 civilians who were being held in the internment camps in the city. And it was a team of only 10 Americans and 2 Chinese advisors who were sent on this mission into a city of millions of people with tens of thousands of Japanese troops still occupying it before Japan's formal surrender. And their mission was to go fly into the city, hope the Japanese would not shoot them out of the air or on the tarmac, and persuade the Japanese military and civilian authorities to let them into the internment camps and take over the care of all the people in them.
Yeah, one of the things that's not very well recognized and known is the fact that one of these missions went in to rescue General Wainwright, who was interned up there in Mukden in Manchuria, as well as some of the Doolittle pilots who were interned in Peking. And one of these teams went in to rescue the pilots and eventually returned them to the States. But it was a very important period in 1945 before the actual surrender of the Japanese on the 2nd of September on the Missouri.
Yes, it was a huge responsibility. And Peter Kim, in the guise of a first lieutenant, but really only a technician 5th grade, was the key to the mission and to its really complete success. There was absolutely no bloodshed in the process. There were no conflicts with the Japanese authorities, who, just their resistance, were persuaded to step aside and give this very small American team full control over all the internment camps. And then they organized the care for these thousands of civilians who were short of food, medicine, pretty much everything needed for their life support. And in the crucial first weeks before American forces arrived, and which Dick was actually a part of, he was in one plane loads of American soldiers sent to take control of Shanghai. This group, with Peter Kim as one of their leaders, quietly performed one of the key missions at the end of the war, and really it disappeared into behind secrecy for the last 80 years.
It's quite an amazing story, but the story continues. And I want to thank Dick and Art and Robert for telling it this far. We're going to stop here. We're going to come back and tell you the rest of the story, both in China and Korea and beyond.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.